The Room of Shadows. Darren had always been skeptical about ghost stories. A former military man, he took pride in his no-nonsense attitude, which made him perfect for guarding the abandoned mental hospital. The building was set for demolition, but with its maze of crumbling hallways and creepy echoes, rumors of paranormal activity spread like wildfire among the staff. On his third night patrolling, Darren noticed a faint whispering sound coming from the basement. He told himself it was the wind funneling through broken windows, but as the sound grew louder, it became clear that the voices were murmuring in low, overlapping tones. Against his better judgment, Darren followed the sound, which seemed to lead to a locked room at the end of the basement corridor. His flashlight flickered ominously as he flipped through his carrying and unlocked the door. Inside, the air was colder than the rest of the building. In the beam of his flashlight, Darren saw a circle of chairs arranged neatly in the center of the room. Each chair was occupied by a life-sized doll, dressed in old-fashioned clothing with porcelain faces gleaming faintly. But what stopped him in his tracks was their heads, each one slightly turned, their glassy eyes fixed on the doorway. A single chair in the circle was empty. The whispering stopped abruptly. Darren stepped back, suddenly aware of the weight of silence pressing down on him. He shut the door without a second glance and bolted upstairs, abandoning the rest of his patrol. Darren called his supervisor and quit on the spot. Rumor has it, the next guard assigned to the site found the dolls moved, but no one dared to inspect the room again. The Silent Children. Rory was the night guard for an abandoned elementary school scheduled for redevelopment. He found the job boring, though the creaking hallways and rusted playground outside gave him occasional chills. The school had been abandoned for decades, yet it felt as if it was still alive with an eerie energy. One stormy night, Rory was doing his usual rounds when his flashlight beam caught something unusual on the floor: wet footprints. Small ones, like a child's bare feet. The odd thing was, he had locked every door, and there was no sign of anyone breaking in. The prints trailed off down the hall, disappearing into the gymnasium. With mounting unease, Rory followed the footprints. The gym was dark, and the moonlight coming through shattered windows made the shadows stretch and twist unnaturally. He shone his flashlight around and froze. In the middle of the gym floor, there was a spiral pattern made of children's toys, rubber balls, marbles, a headless doll, and an old tricycle. Dust hung heavy in the air, but the toys were pristine, as if someone had just placed them there. As Rory stared, he heard faint, high-pitched laughter coming from behind him. Spinning around, his flashlight illuminated the empty bleachers. The laughter continued, echoing softly, but no one was there. Rory sprinted back to his station and refused to patrol the gym again. When the school was finally demolished, construction workers reported hearing the same laughter, even as they tore down the walls. The Lurking Figure. Matt was working the night shift at an abandoned factory, a hulking structure of broken glass and rusted steel that had been left to decay for decades. On most nights, the building was silent, save for the occasional skittering of rats or the groan of metal beams shifting in the wind. One particularly cold night, Matt was doing his rounds when he passed a set of old windows. In the reflection, he saw a tall, dark figure standing several feet behind him. It was too distinct to be a trick of the light, a man-shaped shadow with long arms and no discernible features. Matt spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was no one there. Uneasy, he turned back to the window and saw the figure again, still standing in the same spot. He moved away from the window to check behind him again, but the area was empty. Over the next hour, Matt kept catching glimpses of the figure in reflective surfaces, windows, puddles, even the polished buttons of his radio. No matter how quickly he turned around, there was nothing behind him. Finally, after seeing the shadow in the glass of the security booth, he decided to abandon his post and wait for sunrise in his car. A week later, the factory's new security guard reported seeing the same shadowy figure. When the factory was finally investigated by paranormal enthusiasts, they claimed the figure was a residual haunting, tied to a worker who had died in a machinery accident years ago. The Locked Piano. Emily had taken a temporary security gig at an abandoned theater that was once the crown jewel of the city's arts scene. Now, it was a ghost of its former glory: rows of decaying seats, curtains heavy with dust, and a grand chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling. During one of her patrols, Emily heard a faint tinkling sound, like the keys of a piano being pressed. The noise was coming from the main stage. She hesitated, knowing the only piano in the building was a massive grand piano that had been bolted shut years ago to deter vandals. As she stepped onto the stage, the piano fell silent. The air was so still that Emily could hear her own breathing. She approached the instrument cautiously, shining her flashlight over its polished surface. The lid was still bolted shut, and a thick layer of dust covered the keys. Then she noticed something odd: fresh fingerprints in the dust, as if someone had been playing moments ago. Suddenly, a single, loud note echoed through the theater. Emily jumped back, her flashlight flickering wildly. She swore she saw the piano lid shift slightly, as if something inside was trying to push it open. Emily backed away, keeping her flashlight trained on the piano until she was out of the room. She spent the rest of the night in the lobby and refused to return to the stage. Weeks later, workers attempting to move the piano claimed it was unnaturally heavy, as if something was inside weighing it down. When they forced the lid open, they found nothing but cobwebs, and a deep scratch mark running the length of the piano's interior. The crawling room. Ethan, a seasoned security guard, had been stationed at an abandoned hotel that was once the pride of a bustling city. Over time, economic downturns and urban decay left the grand structure to rot. Its once opulent ballroom was filled with broken chandeliers, the carpeted floor is now damp and moldy. On a particularly quiet night, Ethan decided to inspect the upper floors, which were rumored to be unsafe due to structural issues. As he ascended the grand staircase, he noticed something odd: faint scratch marks on the banister, as if someone, or something, had dragged their nails along the wood. The air grew colder as he reached the third floor, and a smell hit him, a rancid stench, like rotting meat. He traced the smell to a room with its door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, Ethan's flashlight revealed a sight he would never forget. The walls and ceiling were covered in long, claw-like marks, as though a wild animal had been trapped inside. The furniture was overturned, and in the center of the room was a pile of broken glass. As he moved closer, the beam of his flashlight caught something in the far corner of the room. It was small and humanoid, crouched low to the ground, with skin that looked stretched and translucent over its bones. Its head snapped toward him, revealing hollow eye sockets that seemed to burn with a pale, blue light. Before Ethan could move, the creature scuttled toward the wall and climbed it with unnatural speed, disappearing through a vent in the ceiling. Ethan stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight, and bolted out of the hotel. He reported the encounter, but when police investigated the room, all they found were the scratches, and the faint remains of what looked like human hair stuck to the walls. The echoing footsteps. Lila was assigned to guard an abandoned subway station that had been sealed off decades ago. The tunnels were pitch black, the air thick with dust, and the only sounds were the faint dripping of water and the hum of distant city traffic above. One night, as Lila was making her rounds, she heard it, a single set of footsteps echoing down the tunnel. At first, she thought it might be a trespasser. She called out, her voice reverberating back to her, but no one replied. Her flashlight caught no movement, but the footsteps continued, now closer. They were slow and deliberate, like someone walking barefoot. Lila's heartbeat quickened as she scanned the tunnel ahead. Then the footsteps stopped. She let out a shaky breath, trying to convince herself it was her imagination. But just as she was about to turn around, the footsteps started again, this time behind her. She whipped her flashlight around, but there was nothing there. The sound continued to approach until it was right next to her, though no one was visible. Terrified, Lila bolted back to her security post, where she locked the door and refused to go back out. She later learned from a local historian that the station was abandoned after a tragic accident killed several workers during its construction. Some said their spirits never left, doomed to wander the tunnels forever. The Man in the Mirror. Jake, a night guard at a sprawling abandoned shopping mall, always felt uneasy walking through the massive space alone. The mall had been closed for years, and vandals had done their damage. Broken glass, spray paint, and ruined displays were everywhere. The worst part was the eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of settling walls. One night, as Jake walked past an old department store, he noticed something strange in the cracked mirror display. His reflection was there, but something was off. At first, he thought it was a trick of the fractured glass, but then he realized, his reflection wasn't moving in sync with him. Jake froze, staring into the mirror. His reflection tilted its head slowly to one side, though Jake hadn't moved. Then it smiled, a wide, toothy grin that was entirely unnatural. He stepped back, his flashlight trembling in his hand, but the reflection didn't follow him. Instead, it raised a hand and beckoned him forward. Without thinking, Jake turned and ran. He swore he could hear faint laughter echoing behind him as he fled the store. When he told his supervisor, they laughed it off, but Jake refused to patrol near the department store again. The next guard assigned to the mall quit after reporting strange movements in the mirrors. The Singing Woman. Carlos was patrolling an abandoned mansion that had once belonged to a wealthy family before falling into ruin. The locals said the house was cursed, and Carlos, a skeptic, shrugged off the stories, until his fourth night on the job. As he walked past the grand staircase, he heard it, a woman singing, soft and melodic, like a lullaby. The sound drifted down from the second floor, though Carlos knew no one else was supposed to be in the house. Gripping his flashlight tightly, he climbed the stairs. The singing grew louder, leading him to a bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and when Carlos peeked inside, the singing stopped abruptly. Inside the room was an old rocking chair, swaying gently as if someone had just stood up from it. A dusty music box sat on a nearby table, its lid open but its mechanism still. Carlos's gut told him to leave, but his curiosity got the better of him. He stepped into the room and immediately felt a chill. Before he could inspect further, the door slammed shut behind him. Panicking, he tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then the singing began again, this time right behind him. Carlos refused to look back. He closed his eyes and muttered prayers under his breath until the door suddenly creaked open. He fled the house and resigned the next day. Later, he learned that the mansion's previous owner had gone mad after her children disappeared, spending her final days rocking and singing in that very room. The locked ward. Victor was assigned to guard a long-abandoned hospital, a sprawling structure that had once served as an asylum in the early 1900s. The place was infamous for its grim history, stories of unethical experiments, mysterious deaths, and disappearances of patients. One night, while patrolling the fourth floor, Victor noticed something odd. A door at the end of the hallway, one he was certain had been padlocked earlier, was now slightly open. A dim, flickering light spilled out into the hallway. He approached cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Inside, he found a small room with a metal bed frame bolted to the floor and cracked tiles covering the walls. What immediately caught his attention was the message smeared on the far wall, written in a reddish-brown substance, "Help me." Then, he noticed something even more disturbing, handprints, hundreds of them, pressed into the grime on the walls, ceiling, and even the floor, all leading toward the bed. As Victor stepped closer, his radio crackled to life with static, followed by a voice whispering his name. He whipped around, shining his flashlight into the hallway, but it was empty. When he turned back, the handprints seemed to have shifted, their positions now pointing toward the doorway where he stood. Without thinking, Victor backed out of the room and slammed the door shut. When he returned later with backup, the door was locked tight again, as if it had never been opened. The frozen figures. Hal was a security guard at an abandoned meatpacking plant. The place was massive, with its vast cold storage rooms and long disused assembly lines. Most of the building had been stripped of machinery, but the chill of the place remained, even years after it had closed. During one of his routine rounds, Hal heard a strange sound, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from the basement level. At first, he thought it was a pipe expanding, but as he descended the stairs, the sound became louder and more deliberate, like something pounding against a wall. The sound led him to a large freezer unit. The door hung slightly open, and when he peered inside, his flashlight revealed rows of mannequins standing in the icy room. They were life-sized, dressed in tattered clothing, and positioned as if frozen mid-movement. One appeared to be reaching for the door, another crouched low with its hands covering its face. Hal knew the mannequins hadn't been there before. As he backed away, the freezer door suddenly slammed shut, and the thumping sound stopped. He tried to pry it open but couldn't budge it. When he called for assistance and returned with his supervisor, the freezer was empty. No mannequins. No pounding. Just the cold, suffocating silence. The spiral stairs. Ramon had always been intrigued by old architecture, which made his job guarding an abandoned mansion more interesting than terrifying. At first, the house was a maze of grand staircases and secret rooms, but the most striking feature was the spiral staircase that led to a sealed-off attic. One evening, Ramon was doing his rounds when he noticed a faint trail of muddy footprints leading toward the staircase. The strange thing was, the prints started from nowhere. There were no other tracks leading into the house. As he followed them, the air grew colder, and the house's usual creaks and groans seemed to fall silent. The footprints stopped at the base of the spiral staircase. Ramon's flashlight flickered as he began to ascend. About halfway up, he heard it, the faint sound of a woman humming. It was soft at first, but as he climbed, it grew louder. When he reached the attic door, the humming stopped. Ramon hesitated, hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The door swung open on its own, revealing a dusty, pitch-black attic. His flashlight beam caught a single rocking chair in the center of the room. It was rocking slowly, creaking with every sway. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, and the room plunged into darkness. Ramon felt a rush of cold air and heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling him. He clawed at the door until it finally gave way, and he tumbled down the stairs. He refused to enter the mansion again. The next morning, the footprints leading to the staircase were gone, but new ones were found leading down. The Whispering Dolls. Sandra was patrolling an abandoned daycare center, a place that had been shut down abruptly years ago due to financial scandals. The building was small, but its dark hallways and the lingering smell of mildew made it an unpleasant place to work. During one late-night patrol, Sandra noticed a faint glow coming from one of the classrooms. When she stepped inside, she froze. The room was filled with dolls of all shapes and sizes, sitting in a semicircle on the floor. They hadn't been there earlier in the week. Her flashlight illuminated their faces, porcelain and plastic, each one cracked or faded from years of neglect. Some were missing eyes, others had twisted limbs, but all seemed to be staring at her. Then she heard it, faint, disjointed whispers coming from the dolls. It was as if they were murmuring to one another in a language she couldn't understand. Her flashlight flickered as the whispers grew louder. Suddenly, one of the dolls toppled over, its head cracking against the floor. Sandra turned to leave, but as she stepped into the hallway, she felt a sharp tug on her ankle. When she looked down, one of the dolls had moved. It was now lying just outside the doorway, its tiny hand outstretched. Sandra kicked it away and sprinted out of the building. She later learned from a co-worker that the daycare had been shut down after a child went missing on the property, never to be found. The hallway that never ends. Tom had worked security at countless abandoned properties, but none gave him the same unease as the old university building. Its long, dark corridors stretched endlessly, and strange drafts of cold air would sweep past even on warm nights. One evening, Tom noticed something peculiar. As he patrolled the east wing, he passed a hallway that wasn't on the blueprints. It seemed to stretch impossibly far, the dim emergency lights overhead flickering. Curious, Tom decided to walk down the hall, shining his flashlight ahead. No matter how far he walked, the hallway seemed to grow longer. Doors on either side were locked, and the walls were bare except for a faint pattern of scratches that ran along the floorboards. After what felt like an hour, Tom turned around to head back, but the hallway behind him had disappeared. Now there were only endless doors on either side, and the emergency lights above flickered more erratically. Panic set in as Tom sprinted forward, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. Finally, he burst through a door at the end, finding himself back in the security office. Checking the cameras, he saw something chilling. In the east wing, the hallway he'd just exited didn't exist. When he told his supervisor, they dismissed him, claiming the stress of the job had gotten to him. But Tom swore he could still hear faint footsteps echoing in his dreams, growing louder each night. The shadow in the auditorium. Frank had the unenviable job of guarding an old high school that had been abandoned after a fire rendered it unsafe. Though most of the structure was still intact, parts of the building were blackened with soot, and the smell of smoke lingered, even years later. One night, as Frank was checking the gymnasium, he heard the faint sound of a piano playing. The sound was soft, melodic, and eerily out of place. Curious, he followed the sound to the auditorium, where a grand piano still stood untouched on the stage. As he entered, the music stopped abruptly. His flashlight swept across rows of torn seats and up to the stage, but the piano sat silent, untouched. He climbed the steps to inspect it, noting that its keys were dusty and undisturbed. As Frank turned to leave, he saw movement in the corner of his eye. Near the back of the auditorium, a tall, dark figure was standing in the shadows. Its silhouette was human-like but unnaturally still, its head slightly tilted. "Who's there?" Frank called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. The figure didn't respond, it didn't move at all. Gathering his courage, he shone his flashlight at it, but as the beam hit the spot where the figure had been, it was gone. Frank spun around, feeling a sudden chill as if someone was standing right behind him. He left the auditorium and reported the incident, but no trespassers were ever found. A former teacher later confided to him that a music instructor had died in the fire, refusing to leave her piano. The drowning room. Becca was tasked with guarding an abandoned water treatment plant located on the outskirts of town. The place was a sprawling network of concrete tanks and rusting machinery, surrounded by overgrown weeds and forgotten by time. The locals called it the drowning place, though Becca never understood why, until her third shift. While patrolling one of the main buildings, she noticed a wet trail leading from the plant's large water tanks into a nearby office. The floor was dry when she'd walked through earlier, and no rain had fallen that night. Following the trail, she entered the office and found a single chair sitting in the center of the room. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling above it, pooling on the floor below. As Becca stepped closer, the dripping stopped. A sudden feeling of pressure filled the room, as if the air had been sucked out. Then she heard it, a wet, gurgling sound, like someone gasping for breath underwater. She froze as the puddle on the floor began to ripple, the water rising as though something unseen was pushing through it. A pale, bloated hand emerged, clawing at the air. Becca screamed and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Later, she learned the plant had been abandoned after an accident claimed the lives of several workers, one of whom had drowned in the tank directly above the office. The looping hallway. Kevin worked at an abandoned office building downtown. It had once been the headquarters of a successful law firm before it was suddenly vacated under mysterious circumstances. The building still held desks, chairs, and even stacks of old case files, as if the employees had simply walked out one day and never returned. One night, Kevin was patrolling the third floor when he noticed something odd. The hallway, which usually ended in a locked conference room, now seemed to stretch farther than it should. Curious, he walked toward the end, his boots echoing loudly on the tiled floor. As he approached the new end of the hallway, it bent sharply to the left. Kevin turned the corner, only to find himself staring at the same stretch of hallway he'd just walked through. The conference room door was gone, replaced by the same endless corridor. Thinking he had somehow gotten turned around, Kevin retraced his steps. But no matter how far he walked, the hallway looped back to the same spot. Panic set in as he began running, but the looping never stopped. Finally, Kevin stopped and pounded on one of the locked doors, shouting for help. His radio crackled to life, and he heard his own voice calling for backup, except the words were distorted, playing in reverse. After what felt like hours, Kevin stumbled into an empty stairwell and fled the building. When he checked the floor plans later, the hallway didn't exist.